This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, our guest is retired Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Phelps on his book, On Killing Remotely, The Psychology of Killing with Drones. Lieutenant Colonel Phelps looks at the impact of drones in combat and their effect on the military units operating them remotely. He's interviewed by former U.S. Air Force officer Sarah Kreps.
Wayne, it is great to have you here today to talk about your book, On Killing Remotely. This is a really well-written book, a real tour de force. It canvases everything from the history of warfare to the laws of war to operators' psychologies about drones. So we're going to talk for a little bit about the book, and I want to hear from you about many different aspects of that. Maybe the place to start is, why did you decide to write this book on drones?
Thanks, Sarah. I'm really excited to talk to you about this today. I was inspired to write this based off of my last job in the Marine Corps. I was the commanding officer of a drone squadron in Hawaii for 2 years. And during that period, I sent four groups of Marines overseas to fight in a contingency against a violent extremist organization. And during that time, we contributed to over 100 strikes on these enemy fighters. And it got me thinking of how this kind of work actually impacts the operators that are doing these kinds of operations remotely. So then I started researching and expanding that into armed remotely piloted aircraft or drones as we commonly know them. So I started researching that.
Well, so there have been a lot of books written on drones, but I haven't come across any that have the perspective that yours does, which really seems one of the big takeaways from it is the emphasis on how people who fly and operate the drones, how they respond to that interaction between kind of themselves, the drone, and the target. And so that seems to be really kind of a novel perspective. And it sounds like you come about this from really a kind of firsthand perspective of having interacted with that community. But you start off, I think, in a really nice way by walking through kind of the early history of standoff weapons. So it's a really interesting genealogy, and I think tells a really effective story that the interest in motivation in avoiding hand-to-hand combat and generating advantages is far from new. I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about that chapter where you really go through kind of that history where, we think about where we are today with drones, and some people refer to that as revolutionary. It seems that what you're trying to paint is a picture that this is much more kind of an evolution of something that has been going on for centuries, really.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's our natural tendency to develop weapon systems that allow us to fight from further and further distance. It keeps the employers of those weapon systems removed from harm's way when possible, while still being effective. And I started off that chapter by looking at weapons that were employed at distance, going back to thinking about throwing a rock at somebody and then evolving it over the history of fighting, really. So you get into the longbow, right, and the arrow, and how that was initially wasn't well received. It was kind of viewed as a peasant's weapon, and the code of honor and fighting like a knight at the time was was the way that was perceived to fight with honor. So when you introduce something that puts somebody further from harm's way, it wasn't well received. And then you start seeing things like the introduction of gunpowder and rifles, and you're fighting from further and further removed from the situation, all the way up through World War II, where you've got V1 and V2 rockets fired by the Germans, the British. the introduction of satellite communications and GPS, global positioning systems, allowed us to expand that. And then you get into precision-guided munitions, such as GPS-guided bombs and laser-guided munitions. And then really I see armed drones as kind of the culmination of all of that, where you have all of these technologies coming to play on one system that's fully integrated, that allows us to fly an aircraft on the other side of the planet and conduct a tactical strike on a target. So you've got satellite communications, GPS-guided or laser-guided munitions, and then you've got this persistent platform that can fly for sometimes upwards of a day and send video back to the operators that are seeing this in near real time with about 1.8 seconds of latency and what's happening on the other side of the world. So I really wanted to demonstrate that fighting in this manner is a progression, and it's an evolution, and it's not anything new. This has always been kind of the way that we've trended.
Right, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And so I was curious with this expression that you use in the book, the unchivalrous peasant's weapon. And so in some ways, kind of this, and that's sort of the longbow that you were associating with that phrase. And so I guess I wonder, through this kind of theory of transitivity, if the longbow, so we have this evolution and that you're drawing between where we are now and there. And you describe that as kind of the unchivalrous peasant's weapon. Would you say that's what the drone is, or you're suggesting that others kind of labeled it that? And in fact, this is a kind of reasonable approach to take in a combat setting, to try to kind of minimize one's own casualties and be as kind of removed from it as possible.
Well, I think there's still two lines of thought. There's one that thinks that it's absolutely an unchivalrous way to fight, where there's no skin in the game. You're not risking anything. And then the other line of thought is that it provides a tactical advantage for those that are employing it. So there's, and that's kind of the ultimate goal of fighting, is to be able to, attack your enemies where and when you can, while removing your friendly forces from harm's way.
So that makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned at the outset, a big focus of the book is on kind of the psychology of this experience of being a drone operator. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of what that experience is like and what makes that kind of unusual compared to let's say the V1 or the longbow, from the perspective of the person who has kind of initiated this form of force.
So we've been employing armed drones for about 20 years now. So we've got almost 2 decades of fighting in this manner. And what most people experience, and what my experience was in the Marine Corps, was that when I fought in conflicts, was that I would physically deploy to that location, and I would conduct the fighting in that manner, and I would be away from my family for 6 to 8 months at a time, and there would be a mental transition in the beginning of that, where I'd mentally prepare myself to go into harm's way. I would deploy with another group of Marines. We would be there together. We'd experience this hardship together. And then we would mentally prepare to transition back to, home life in the United States. So one of the biggest changes that we have seen with the employment of armed drones is that mental transition occurs on almost a daily basis. They're particularly within the Air Force, where they're flying remotely piloted aircraft at, say, Creech base near Las Vegas. So that mental transition occurs when you wake up at your house in the morning and then you drive to work. You basically commute to combat, and you'll fly a combat sortie or a combat mission on the other side of the planet. You might have a strike, during that period of time, and then you're mentally transitioning yourself to return home at the end of the day. So a lot of the people that I interviewed talked about this strange feeling that they often refer to as deployed in garrison, where you're conducting combat operations from home, and you're doing these transitions on daily basis, sometimes working 12, 14-hour shifts, several days a week. So you have these strange periods of work where you're mentally deployed and you're physically still in the United States. And you may have conducted a strike at some period during your mission, and then you may be in time, home in time for dinner with your family, or seeing, a soccer game, or picking up milk from the store or something like that, right? So it's unlike anything that most traditional warriors have ever experienced in the past. So that's just, I think that's the biggest change in the psychology of how these warriors are actually fighting.
So it seems that there are pros and cons, like everything in life, there are trade-offs. And so when I was in the Air Force, I came in the late 90s, and this was after really still in the midst of Operation Southern Watch and Northern Watch. And these operators were so burned out because they'd go and deploy for a year at a time. And they would miss their kids' birthdays and their wives and their anniversaries. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing either. And so, it seems like the ability to go home and celebrate your 5-year-old's birthday is a plus. And so is it a matter of this is a bad thing, or is this just kind of an adjustment of psychology? I was thinking, as you were talking about that, kind of the lack of boundaries, that's in some ways kind of not quite analogous, but now we've all been working from home during the pandemic. And so no one really, the boundaries between your work and your kids' school and, everything else, maybe you hear the dog barking here in the background. That's all very, it is somewhat analogous. I'm not in my day-to-day now going and operating or conducting a war across the world, but I wonder whether that's just the 21st century, and rather than kind of lament that we don't have these boundaries, that we just kind of adjust to this world we're in.
Yeah, I think we're adjusting. I think there are better methods that we could use to this new way of fighting. One example is shift work, right? So a lot of the Air Force squadrons conduct rotating shifts. So rather than being on day shift for 12 hours for your entire tour, you will shift between day shift and mid shift or night shift. So and you're doing that fairly routinely. Some squadrons are doing it every 6 weeks or so. So that's causing your circadian rhythm to completely be in disarray. So you have this constant feeling of jet lag almost. It takes quite a long time for your circadian rhythm to adjust from going from day shift to night shift. And doing it every 6 weeks and shifting back and forth is really, I don't think is ideal. I'm trying to think of another occupation that does this, goes into harm's way.
I was thinking about the case of the medical community, where you have, so my brother's a doctor and he will work nights for a couple of months and then shift to days. And it is also a matter of life and death. And there have been some questions in the medical community about, let's say, whether residents are working too many hours, but there doesn't seem to be any sense that we should kind of shift from, I mean, it's almost a reality. I think that's where I also was thinking about this comparison with hospitals, is that you can't not serve people between 11 at night and 7 in the morning, because people can't control when they have a heart attack or can't control when they're going to have a baby. Yeah. And you can't control when there's a high value asset that's going to pop up in the tribal areas of Pakistan. And so isn't it just that there are these kinds of exigencies of life and death that may just kind of demand more from certain professions?
I think you're right. I also think there's probably a better way to tackle that problem, at least within the drone community. Maybe you extend the period of time longer than 6 weeks so someone can adjust. And one of the things I think I recommended in the book was that you base it off of seniority, kind of like law enforcement officers do, where if you've been there longer, then you get to bid on which shift you want to be on. I think the constant switching back and forth is fairly harmful for sleep, and then when you're trying to sleep in the daytime and your family's home, there's going to be natural interruptions as well. So, but yeah, law enforcement, medical professionals that do shift work, I think that's a fairly good comparison.
Right. One of the things I was thinking about as I was reading the book is that. And why I think this book is such a contribution is that so much of the early work on drones was about, again, kind of these legal questions and the effectiveness questions, and whether it was creating backlash, kind of martyrdom effects of creating more terrorists than they were killing, and there was all this kind of conjecture, if it was discussed at all, about the effect of these operations on those who were operating these drones. And I think one of the things that was sort of, as often happens with technology, the technology kind of gets out there and then we kind of study the consequences of it later. And I think in this case, there was a sense that, well, these operators are shielded from all of these kind of psychological impacts of war. Infantry has a much kind of harder time with it because they're in much closer proximity. But I think what you do a really effective job of doing is showing just kind of that this isn't, I don't think you're trying to compare and say that these operators have it as hard as an infantry person, but to say, look, this isn't antiseptic for them. They are experiencing these costs in ways that that I think weren't known when this technology started being employed. And you do a lot of really good interviews. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the kind of sentiment that you collected as part of these interviews and how you actually did your interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. I think initially when we started, employing drones in this manner, the sentiment was there's no way that somebody could be experience any sort of traumatic events or things like that because they're not physically going into harm's way. There's no reason why anyone should complain about doing this kind of work because their life is not at risk. And there was little to no sympathy for those initially that said, "Hey, I'm actually struggling with this. I'm having a hard time." Or I've experienced, something traumatic that's happened, and I think over time that's actually shifted. There's been several studies within the Air Force by a psychologist named Dr. Chappell, who's looked at prevalence of PTSD in drone pilots and sensor operators and the intelligence community that's supporting these operations. And initially, 2014, he came out and said that there was a prevalence of PTSD roughly around 4% within the community of those he studied. That kind of led to this introduction of these human performance teams that were embedded within Air Force squadrons. And human performance teams are like a mental health professional, a doctor, counselor, chaplain, things like that, that had a clearance that could actually talk about the mission and details and the events that occurred with a lot of these pilots. 2 years later, Dr. Chappell did another study, and the rate of PTSD went up to 6%. And you're right, Sarah. I'm not trying to compare, the work that people are doing remotely to the work that is required to deploy into harm's way, whether you're infantry or you're manning a fighter aircraft or an attack helicopter. It's not an apples to apples comparison in my mind. As I say in the book, it's not a suffering competition, right? What I'm trying to bring to light is that everyone has a specific occupation within the military, and I think it's important that we recognize the challenges that these folks actually go through in this occupation. So I did an anonymous survey of 254 people, 243 of which had actually used a drone for a strike, or they'd used a drone to call in a strike for something else, right? But the key thing was that they had to feel responsible and accountable for the effects that happened during an operation. And then I conducted over 50 first-person interviews with people within the community as well. So, qualitative and quantitative research to try to get an understanding and hear some of the things, the challenges that they go through. The interviews really brought to light some things that I didn't get out of the survey, such as the physiological responses that happen during a strike. And I found that to be fascinating. So several studies that talk about, or several books that talk about physiological responses to lethal force encounters that are face-to-face, whether it's law enforcement or military, right? You're going to have an increased heart rate, perhaps sweaty palms, auditory exclusions, tunnel vision, things like that, right? So it makes sense that happens when you're in a fight for your life. When somebody is physically trying to kill you, that makes sense that your body would respond in that way. I also heard from a lot of sensor operators, drone pilots, and things like that they had similar physiological responses in those situations, leading up to a strike, which seems counterintuitive. They're completely removed from harm's way. Why would they experience something like that? Sweaty palms, adrenaline spikes, auditory exclusions, time distortion, all of those kinds of things still happen. And what the reason I think that it happens is because of the cognitive distance as opposed to the physical distance. I think cognitively they feel like they're there. They feel like they're in the fight, and several of them told me they were mentally deployed during those missions. So I think the physiological response is interesting as well.
So, you talked about cognitive distance, but I was thinking also about cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, the sweaty palms and the adrenaline rush, but one of the passages that caught my attention was where, the surveillance part of this mission, you may be watching someone for weeks at a time. And you can't, as we were saying a few minutes ago, you won't know whether the strike, you can't time when they're going to come out of hiding and pop up and be visible, and that the strike is going to happen. And so there was a passage where it talked about the person who had surveilled this target for weeks, and then they weren't on the shift when the actual strike took place, and kind of that side of things surprised me in a way.
Yeah, I interviewed one sensor operator who was conducting a mission. Basically, he had the same high-value individual, or HVI, that he was watching routinely, day in, day out, waiting for the right moment or the right time to strike this target when they could mitigate or eliminate any sort of collateral damage or civilian casualties, right? So they're waiting for the right time to strike the target. That's something that this new capability gives us, is tactical patience. And I know there's a lot of discussions about civilian casualties that occurs with drones, but what we don't talk about a lot is the fact that this thing can fly for hours on end. It's got a high definition camera that allows you to see and pick the right point, and you have an entire team of intelligence folks and lawyers and everybody else on the backside that can watch the video as well and provide input for when the time is right to strike the target. So this sensor operator that I interviewed had been conducting what we call a pattern of life mission. He was trying to determine the pattern of life of this target to figure out the right time to strike this target. And he said, he knew more about this individual than probably his roommate. He could pick this individual out in a crowd based off of his gait, his hand gestures, just his normal human behavior. He could pick him out. And he developed, almost this one-sided intimacy with this target. And, he was off on a routine day, and when he came back to work, someone else had struck that target. And he had this sense of almost loss, like that was his target to strike. He'd been working on it. And it was like a sense where there was no closure for him. And I think that was fairly common amongst people that I talked to, was they had a sense of ownership and accountability of these individuals that they were watching. And that doesn't always work well for them, obviously. There's times where I talked to another individual who had been working a target for almost 2 years. And he saw that, the daily intimate human details of this individual who was a father. He would see him playing with his kids in the backyard, picking them up from school, things like that, mixed in with some nefarious activities that made him a target in the first place. And he said when he eventually did get the authorization to strike that target, it was difficult for him because he knew that guy was a good father. And the individual being a father himself could relate to that. You could see the humanity of that target.
Sounds a little bit like I don't know if there's an expression for this, but the reverse of Stockholm syndrome, where a captive kind of gains a sense of sympathy for the captor. And here it's kind of the reverse, is that you come to see that even amidst this nefariousness, these are real people. These are fathers. These are people living not that dissimilarly from how we are.
Yeah, there was a paper written called Avengers in Wrath by Karen House and Dave Blair, who was an Air Force RPA pilot. And in that article, they refer to that as cognitive combat and intimacy. In the book, I just refer to it as intimacy with the target. So it's developing this one-sided intimacy with this target. I don't think it's dissimilar to feelings that people have when they watch a TV show and they feel like they know Ross or Rachel from Friends, right? Because you're watching these people for a long period of time.
So one of the things that I was wondering, I don't know if you've been asked this before, but I often have been asked about the convergence between kind of what actually happens and the perspective of the operator and a pilot in real life versus the movie Eye in the Sky. Did you happen to see that movie?
Is that the one with Ethan Hawke?
I was going to say Judi Dench.
Okay, I don't think I've seen that movie, but
so this is it's these kind of US UK joint operation or allied operation, and they are watching this. They see the suicide bomber put on his vest. And it's, some of this, the reason why I think that people ask me this don't always know how much of this is real, how much of it isn't. But there's this opening vignette, and this kind of nano drone flies in the window to conduct video surveillance. They see this guy put on his surveillance or his suicide vest, just to kind of eliminate that question of like, is he a bad guy? Is he not? No, we all see that he is a bad guy. And then it's what you were describing. So this drone then kind of tracks this guy every day for weeks, and then there's this point in the movie where they have a clear target that this guy is unassisted. He's by himself, and the kind of wrinkle in this is that at the kind of last minute, this cute little girl who's selling bread goes up within proximity of him to the point where that any strike is also going to kill her. And there's this debate behind the scenes between and among the operators about kind of what do we do? Like this wasn't part of, this was part of the scenario because someone in the movie had gone to basically pay her for the entire day of bread and said, just go home. And she didn't know why, of course, go home. But these debates behind the scenes about how do we think about some of these wrinkles? And, I think it brings up these questions of like, who's deciding? What are the kind of who's empowered to make these decisions? And what are these decision-making conversations actually look like?
Oh, well, that's such a great question. I definitely talk about this in the book that drones are usually acting on behalf of someone else, right? Someone is requesting a target to be struck, or they're being tasked with striking a target, and they ultimately have the authority to say, no, I'm not going to strike that target. Or the pilot in command of the mission does. But in 99% of the instances, someone is requesting that they strike a target on behalf of, a ground force commander or somebody that's declared a individual as a high value individual that needs to be targeted. There's particularly talking about what you're referring to. There are these things called collateral damage estimates, or CDEs. And based off of the amount of collateral damage that can potentially occur during a strike, there is a different decision authority who authorizes that strike. And depending on how important a high-value individual is, the decision authority can go all the way up to the commander-in-chief sometimes. When President Obama, was in office, he authorized a lot of those strikes personally. So that decision is made by somebody else. It's not made by the drone crew. That they will accept, a certain level of collateral damage, but they're also not the ones that are striking the target. Right. So imagine that you're a pilot or a sensor operator, and in that specific situation you're talking about, you have this high value individual and you have a little girl civilian casualty that can potentially occur, and someone comes back and says, yes, we authorize that strike. Now you're put in this position where someone has said, we'll accept responsibility for that, and you have to carry out the deed. So you're left with this, you do your job, or do you deny the strike? There are some instances, interviews I had where people, actually refused to strike specific targets, whether it was because it was a U.S. citizen, or because there was a known civilian casualty that would occur. And there are some ways, some crafty ways that they can do that, right? They can say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of fuel, or I'm out of ordnance, or they can just flat out refuse to say no. And then there's also instances where they do strike the target. And that's one of the three things that I've determined was likely to cause some sort of a traumatic experience for the operators. Like there's three. Conducting a pattern of life mission on a target for a long period of time, developing an intimacy with that target, and then eventually striking that individual. Watching friendlies on the ground, friendly forces being wounded or killed in action, and not having or not being able to prevent that from happening. Right. So I think there's a connection with friendly forces on the ground as well, despite the physical distance. And then the third thing was, any incident where civilian casualties occur. And those are the three mission-specific events where people told me that they had the hardest time of dealing with that, whether it was a short-term or long-term. So those are the incidents that are most likely to produce some sort of traumatic experience, negative response to killing, or long-term that would lead to PTSD.
So, in a lot of ways that raises questions about kind of, and this gets back to kind of your evolution. One of the next steps that people talk about in the evolution of drones is autonomous drones. And so right now they're semi-autonomous in the sense that they're programmed to kind of fly a particular pattern, but there's still a human in the loop when it comes to conducting lethal force. And the U.S. has said that is something that it would continue to do because some of these decisions are really kind of hard to program into an algorithm. And so I was curious kind of where you would stand on that based on kind of your work and your thinking on this kind of question about whether to move to a fully autonomous drone.
Yeah, so I was fully aware that the book might lead to someone to have an illogical conclusion that humans are suffering from doing this work, so let's remove the human from the decision-making process, and that'll eliminate these problems that humans are having. I do not support that at all. I think that war is a human endeavor, and a human has to make the decision to kill another human. I think it's a slippery slope that we can go down to have a lethal autonomous weapon that senses the environment, makes the determination all on its own through algorithms to say, yes, that's a legitimate target, and then carries out that strike without any sort of meaningful human input in that entire process. I also think that we are not just us as in the U.S., but I think across the world, we're starting to see countries that don't necessarily feel that way, and they're moving in that direction. The Kargu 2 Turkish drone strike in Libya that is under investigation, it supposedly happened, in 2020, is potentially the first noted lethal autonomous drone strike that's occurred in history. We also don't have any regulations or international standards that prevent this from occurring right now. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done on that. But my purpose behind this book was to show that this is how humans respond to this. But I think that it should always be difficult to kill another human, and I don't think we should outsource that to algorithms and machines.
Right. No, it comes back to this scene in the movie where they're trying to kind of figure out this wrinkle of, well, how do we think about the fact that now we have this high value asset, but we have this girl and she's going to be killed. She's the collateral damage. And, there's one perspective in the movie that says, if you were to do this on a piece of paper and a ledger, high value asset here, person here, it would be clear what to do. So don't be so human about it. Just kind of like, you're getting someone really high value. And so, this is consistent with the laws of war, that this is still, the military value is in excess of the civilian damaged incurred. But what is so evocative about this vignette is just that once you see this girl, and, she could be anyone's sister, anyone's daughter, anyone's niece. And it really does humanize it. And it really does kind of raise this conundrum is, is a better form of war where you take the human perspective out and just kind of make it less personal. And so, you answered that question, that it should always be a human endeavor. But I think the reason why, as you say in the book, that drones do work that is dull, dirty, and dangerous is that we've now already gone a step in that direction. And as you suggest, if the Russians move in the fully autonomous direction, I was actually just researching that case in Libya of the Kargu 2, and my editor said, well, it actually did not operate. They can operate in manual mode or fully autonomous mode, and it appears that the human was still in the loop. But in some ways, the perception is what matters. And if the perception was that it was fully autonomous, now we've kind of gone a little bit further down that slippery slope of, well, they've already done this. Why are we playing with one hand tied behind our backs?
Yeah, I think we run the risk of losing a competitive advantage because humans can't compete in the same decision-making cycle as quick as machines, right? So are we going to allow ourselves to either, I think there's two situations. We either lose our humanity or we lose a fight. And neither one of those are great options. I still fully advocate for humans being the ones that make these decisions, right? Because there's bias in programming, coding of algorithms. There's little details in missions that only a human would be able to sense, right? It's not ones and zeros in making decisions of getting to a yes or no kill. There's a whole bunch of context that only humans can pick up on.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I want to shift, I guess, a little bit to, it's still on the question of how we think about conflict and some aspect of norms and law. And one of the things you talk about is this question of sovereign airspace. And one of the things that I've actually had conversations with people about is, how would we, how do we even adjudicate this question of violations of sovereign airspace? Because we have kind of, let's say in the Pakistani government case, that they publicly do not want to acknowledge that they may have invited this strike because they have a domestic political argument in favor of not looking like they are green-lighting U.S. military action. But, because the U.S. for so long was the most visible actor using lethal drone strikes, there were other countries that may have been kind of drawing inferences that were different from this perspective that it was lawful. And I'm curious, what's different when there's an actual pilot, and we saw this with Gary Powers in 1962. The pro and the con is that when he went down over enemy airspace, it was a huge diplomatic event where there's no, and when a drone gets shot down now, there's no such kind of acrimony and escalation. And it seems that can kind of cut both ways in terms of, it gets a little bit not just at the questions of how do we understand sovereignty and whether this has been green lighted and whether therefore it's consistent with the recourse to force, but it also gets at these questions of does using drones, because it's kind of, if this drone goes down over sovereign airspace, there's no prisoner of war that becomes kind of a big diplomatic event. So there's less caution. And you talk about kind of those different aspects in the book. And so I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that here in terms of how do using drones change the calculus of using force?
I think we're still figuring out how drones change the risk calculation for both employing them over sovereign airspace, and what we do in response to if someone shoots down our own drones, right? I definitely argue in the book that I think that drones, the common narrative seems to be that it makes it easier for us to go to war with drones. That it's a low risk option, and therefore we're more likely to be involved in more conflicts because we have this weapon system. And I argue that I don't think that that's the case. I've talked about, I think when President Obama left office, we were conducting strikes and drone strikes in 7 different countries: Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Niger, Iraq. I think that was 7. Pakistan. And in those 7 countries, only one of them were we only conducting drone strikes alone with no other use of military force, right? So in all of the other situations, you have either manned strikes that are occurring, you have special operations teams on the ground, you have other military forces that are being employed. So if it were easier for us to just get involved in conflict solely through the use of drones, then why would we employ other assets in those situations? Pakistan's obviously kind of an anomaly, but we were also, you could view that as an extension of the war in Afghanistan too, where it was a safe haven and kind of had, approval from Pakistan to do that. If there wasn't approval, there were several opportunities for them to shut down our logistics supply train that went through there to get into Afghanistan if they didn't agree with what we were doing. So I don't think that it makes this easier to get involved in conflicts from the beginning solely through using drones. I think it's a low cost, a nice option once we do decide to get involved in conflicts. It's similar to cruise missiles or air power to begin with. It provides an alternative to having boots on the ground, but it also doesn't give us a great probability of success in some of these situations, right? For the reasons why we would get involved in the conflict to begin with. One of them is obviously probability of success. If you're fighting a traditional major theater war, perhaps you be able to use drone strikes a lot to achieve your objectives. If you're fighting a counterinsurgency where you need to influence the population, you're not going to be able to do that solely through drone strikes. On the flip side, when you talk about risk calculation of going to war over an asset being shot down, look at the Global Hawk that Iran shot down over the Middle East, or the RQ-170 that they took control of and landed in their own country and stole, basically. In those situations, if there were a pilot on board of either one of those aircraft, that would have changed the risk calculus for the United States. We probably would have responded in a different manner in that situation. If you shoot down a manned aircraft over international waters and kill a pilot, there's probably some sort of retaliatory, strike or actions that occur. So in that situation, I think it actually made us less likely to get involved or escalate the situation. So I think there's 2 sides to that coin. We're still figuring it out. I don't think we have a solid solution on how to calculate risk of if someone shoots our assets down at this point.
So, looking ahead a little bit, and we have just about a little more than 10 minutes. So I wanted to kind of be a little forward looking, which may push this a little bit beyond the scope of the book itself, but maybe things that people will want to know having read your book, is, as you said, that drones aren't always effective and they're not necessarily game changers and they're not causing conflicts where they didn't exist otherwise. A good example actually of this was in Pakistan itself, where the government was fighting an insurgency, and they'd been doing this for years. And the introduction of Chinese made, it wasn't clear, Chinese parts that were maybe indigenously assembled. Anyway, it looked like a Chinese drone. Was used a few years ago to shoot down and kill 3 insurgents. That was a war that was already happening. So I think it's sort of to your point that this wasn't, the drones didn't now suddenly cause Pakistan to engage in conflict with these insurgents. But it does then make me wonder, so we know that from the data on drone proliferation that 20 years ago, as you said, no country was using armed drones. And then the US was, and Israel and more countries have been both acquiring and using armed drones. Why are they, if these don't matter, why are they so popular?
Well, I definitely think they matter. I think we just need to look at the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia to see a glimpse into what the future of warfare is going to look like when it's so easy for countries these days to build an air force that's fairly effective at a lower cost, much significantly lower cost than what they've been able to do in the past. And that was devastating to that turned into a lopsided conflict because of the employment of armed drones, loitering munitions, things like that. And I think there's a lot of people that are taking note of that and looking at, do I need to invest billions and billions of dollars into a manned air force, or can I build a drone fleet and have achieve the same objectives? I think that's probably the direction that we'll be heading in the future, at least for those countries that can afford that.
And, connecting back to this question of sovereignty earlier, one of the real virtues of drones in this kind of gray zone context is that there's some kind of plausible deniability of, well, we're not fully engaging in conflict. We're kind of sending in unmanned aircraft. And so it's possible to kind of engage in some kind of escalation without it actually kind of becoming an out of control conflict. In some ways, then it speaks maybe to what this calculation, the risk calculus and the escalatory prospects look like, which is the conflict and exchanges can happen at a low, sort of both, it can be more likely in some ways, but also both sides may know that the stakes are lower because fewer people are going to die. We also did see in the recent Gaza conflict that Hamas was using drones, and you mentioned Libya. And so, proliferation means in part that these actors can kind of overcome some of these asymmetric disadvantages that they have in the lack of resources with now really increasingly affordable and capacious off-the-shelf drones.
Yeah.
And is there any way around that? I mean, so, if the U.S. is faced with that, what's the recourse?
Well, we've been faced with that for years, right? I mean, ISIS has been employing drones in Iraq, and they've modified them to drop mortars and bombs and things like that. And initially there was no counter, or at least the counter. The target to or weapon to target match was such an overmatch. You're not shooting a Patriot missile at a $2,000 DJI drone. So there's been a rush to develop counters that are similar to commercial off the shelf that can answer these situations. And there's still drone strikes that are happening in Iraq, that are like Group 2, Group 3 size, 1,000-pound kind of drones that are flying for long distances, pre-programmed through GPS and hitting specific targets. And you can you follow the news, they're all over the place these days, whether they're hitting airfields in Erbil or close to the embassy in Baghdad. That's the new threat. That's the new IED. It's the new AK-47. It's the new suicide vest, and it's very attractive for non-state actors because now they don't even have to risk as much to employ these things. They're commercially available. You can get an autopilot off the internet. You can completely turn it into a dark drone, so it's not emitting any sort of RF energy that can be disrupted through cyber RF defeat techniques. So you have basically a poor man's cruise missile. There's little defense to that right now. So we're playing catch up on the counter to this.
Right. And it seems like, when there have been issues of proliferation and arms control in the past, it was involving kind of the US, USSR, US, Russia. Now these are just so accessible, and the actors that are using them aren't really part of our international governance structure. Is there any sort of, governance response to this, or is it just kind of an offense, defense, measure, countermeasure? Now we're developing countermeasures that can try to address this threat. As you said, it's very real. It's not a weapon of mass destruction, but it's a weapon of disruption in the sense that these drones can fly over typical kind of vehicle barriers, unless manufacturer has geofencing. And so it is quite disruptive, and it seems like there's not really an obvious kind of governance countermeasure. And so is it really in the hands of kind of the defense to figure out exactly what you're saying, the appropriate defense for this?
I think it is. The kinds of governance that would work is not going to be effective against non-state actors, gangs, criminals. They're being employed in Mexico by cartels to attack police and attack other cartels. Governance, that's not going to affect that, right? They're already commercially available. They can modify them to be deadly. No sort of arms control is going to affect that. And where arms control would be effective, I think, is when you start getting into larger systems that can launch, precision guided munitions like missiles and stuff like that. And even then, China is one of the largest exporters of drones, similar to Reapers and Predators, and they're not going to sign on to something like that. And they've actually used our unwillingness to sell to some of these countries as an advantage to sell to them, right? So they've got this market where the U.S., prior to pulling out of the MTCR, wouldn't sell to these countries. So China said, "Well, we'll fill that void and we'll sell you an armed drone."
Well, Wayne, I don't want to end on such a ominous note, but it strikes me as probably a realistic note. So I think you really have done an incredible job in the research and writing of this book. Everything we know, I think, is that drones really are the future of war. And so this book on killing remotely is a great resource. Given all the rich interviews you've done and the way you've woven this into a really readable manuscript. So we really appreciate that you've spent this time with us, and I really recommend that everyone pick up a copy and read it.
Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate your time today. Great questions.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. Be sure to check out our Book Notes Plus podcast. On the latest episode, an interview with the late columnist Robert Novak. He was nicknamed, quote, the Prince of Darkness by friends and enemies alike in Washington, D.C. In this interview from 2007, he discussed his memoir titled The Prince of Darkness, in which he tells stories about his 50 years as a reporter, television personality, author, and conservative commentator.